All right, I'll go ahead and get us started here. Just say a few initial remarks. Hello, everyone. Again, welcome to the Roadway Automated Driving Systems Integration Concept of Operations for Transportation Agencies webinar. My name is Luana Brashias, and I'll help facilitate today's webinar. This webinar is brought to you by the Federal Highway Administration and includes an overview of a concept of operations for roadway automated driving systems integration specifically for use by transportation agencies in the United States. Webinar participants will be introduced to opportunities to apply and evaluate the ConOps as prototype sites and will guide initial efforts to support national introduction and implementation of the ConOps. Just as a quick reminder, at NOCO, we offer a variety of resources to support the transportation systems management and operations community. You can go to NOCO's website, and the website is transportationops.org, to browse through links for TISMO resources and also news. Previous webinar recordings and case studies can be accessed from there as well. Now, just a few logistics for today's webinar. So this webinar is recorded, and the recording will be available on NOCO's website. It usually takes 48 hours approximately. So make sure you can you go and check that out after. All the attendees are encouraged to stay engaged by using the Q&A feature for questions. So if you have any questions, make sure you add that to the Q&A pod. And then you can use the chat feature for comments. So both of those are in the bottom of your screen. So let's try to add all the questions to the Q&A. And if you have any comments or any other conversation that you want to get going, you can add that to the chat. We have a question and answer session at the end of all presentations. So if you have any questions, we encourage you to enter them in the Q&A area as they come to your mind at any time. Also, please feel free to enter your name, your agency in the chat and say hello to your peers. Now, this is just the standard US DOT Federal Highway Administration disclaimer that reinforces product names may be used during the webinar, but the US government does not endorse any product. Additionally, views and opinions expressed in this presentation are the presenters only and do not necessarily reflect those of Federal Highway Administration or the US Department of Transportation. Now, I'll hand it over to Deepak Gopalakrishna. He's the Vice President at ICF and today's webinar moderator. Deepak.
Thank you, Luana, and thank you for the National Operations Center for Excellence for hosting this webinar. It's always a pleasure to work with NOCOE on this effort, and they make the process of conducting these webinars really useful. We have a full agenda today. Thank you again for all of those who are participating. I see a lot of names that are were instrumental in getting this document to publication. So appreciate and acknowledge their contributions to this. Today's speakers include John Harding from the Federal Highway Office of Operations, Ashley Nyland from the Highly Automated Systems Safety Center of Excellence, John Corbin from Federal Highway Office of Operations, Ben Hawkinson from Federal Highway Office of Policy and Governmental Affairs, Jeremy Rao, Office of Planning, and Laurie Mutkowski from Gannon Fleming, in addition to myself. We will be walking through the document, and Luana will post a link to the document in our chat window as well. This document, the ADS integration ConOps, is available on the Federal Highways Office of Operations website and can be downloaded as a PDF. What we will be presenting today is an overview of that document, but also framing the document in the context of broader US DOT and Federal Highways activities around ADS integration. With that, let me turn it over to Ashley Nyland from the US DOT Haas Center for Excellence.
Thank you, Deepak. And good morning or good afternoon to everyone here in the room today. I do want to say thank you to our modal partners at FHWA, John Harding and John Corbin, for the opportunity for me to provide a few opening remarks. This is truly bittersweet for me to be here today. It wasn't so long ago that I shared the seat that many of the IOO participants in the room share, leading CAT-CAV, emerging technology programs for a state or local jurisdiction. I remember very distinctly when FHWA and team reached out and asked CDOT in Colorado to provide some input and feedback on sort of the early versions of ADS. So again, just really a pleasure and honor to be here. And with that being said, from the IOO perspective, I want to say thank you for being here. I can absolutely appreciate that you being here today and being part of this meant that you you probably pulled away from something else. So huge thanks. I do want to spend just a moment on sort of my new role in the team that I'm on now that I joined fairly recently in December of 2022. It's the Highly Automated Systems Safety Center of Excellence in the Office of the Assistant Secretary at the USDOT. And it's a very rapidly growing team. When I joined, there were about 3 or 4 team members, and we recently ramped up to 18. And our sort of core mission is to strengthen departmental expertise on automation. So as such, we work very closely with all operating administrations at the USDOT to really sort of provide additional resource expertise in automation. Automation, of course, impacts the whole transportation system, and there's activities across all of the USDOT that's working in automation. So I'm just delighted to be here. I look forward to hearing the conversation, seeing the rollout, and certainly continuing to support FHWA and anyone here as you leverage this conceptual framework and sort of the concepts in here. So with that being said, I will go ahead and conclude. And again, thank you. And I will pass it over to my colleague, John Harding.
Thank you, Ashley. And to provide some context, I'm going to review some definitions, use cases, explain our focus on facilitating integration of ADS into the roadway system, and also introduce you to a lot of the different activities Federal Highway has going on with road and ADS related projects. So first, let's talk about definitions or terms. Automated driving systems. So we use automated driving systems, SAE levels 3, 4, and 5. And this is when the system can perform the dynamic driving task. So what we're doing is we're taking the human out as the interface between the vehicle and the road and using the system as that interface. Next, use cases. You'll hear more about these use cases in detail when they get to the concept of operations presentation, but this is just a little preview. And what there was is 8 use cases covered by 4 categories. You can see the 4 categories on the right of the screen here. Freight, transit, individual commuting, and agency operations. And just a little preview. These were identified as possible deployments, and it supported stakeholder discussions about roadway integration needs and gaps. And so there's more to come. So we can move on to the next slide. And this is where we get into what we call kind of the elements of road ADS integration. Excuse me. First, we have collaboration. So this is the interaction that supports understanding amongst road providers and ADS developers. And it all is about this road ADS integration. And where are we going? Where do we get to this? So and part of this collaboration is the joint research and development to better understand this road ADS interface. And this is to enhance the safety and mobility as we integrate this technology into the roadway system. This brings us to what we talk about in ADS integration. So one aspect of this is that we're trying to understand what investments in the roadway system do we need to do to support this safe and effective integration with ADS. Now, it might not be specific investments, it might be combined investments, but it gives us this sense of how we move forward with this technology and maybe others as we think about the roadway system and the safety and mobility of the future. In relation to this, we have various projects that touch on different aspects of this. So we start with these projects and activities. The first one is the Cooperative Automation Transportation Coalition. So this has been around for a while. And you can see from this, basically the structure, the different areas it addressed with different public and private, different stakeholders. And what they're trying to do as we move forward is evolve this coalition to better serve and incorporate more different stakeholders, provide a partnership, this collaborative partnership between all the stakeholders, public and private, don't have any opportunities to better understand the integration, to remove barriers, and to better support deployment of connected and automated transportation technologies. Right now, there's a couple activities that we're going to be moving using the CAT Coalition. First, many of you probably heard about interoperable connectivity, the V2X deployment, the deployment plan for connectivity. So the CAT Coalition is going to help with that and supply the stakeholder input. And also, we're moving forward just to have a new kind of coalition that looks a lot at the automated and connectivity transportation technology. So we're all trying to make sure that we hear all the different voices and move forward together. The next area is a collaborative research framework for ADS developers and IOOs, or infrastructure owners and operators. And you can see here in the middle, it's just your basic academic test development sequence, your pre-test, test definition, test execution, post-test, and around it is a wrapper. It starts with collaboration, and then the elements of different parts of collaboration that if you are on the private side or public side, these are areas where you need to start discussion so you understand where you can go with the various tests and what may be some of the boundaries between the public and private sides. And right now we have an outreach program going on to make sure everybody's aware of the publication of this framework and how they may be able to incorporate it and use it as they move forward to have this collaborative research testing going on. Next slide. We start out with the research elements framework. What we did is we created a framework that we heard a lot from the stakeholders that between ADS developers and the road providers that they weren't always interface on the definitions of various roadway elements. So we have an initial framework and we're going to use that as we move forward in this activity to develop a collaboration between the different aspects of road and ADS technology and make sure that we can hopefully get input to develop an inventory of the different roadway features that may be used to support ADS navigation. And from there, we hope to understand better, okay, what could be how do we assess the conditions of these roadway features in relation to supporting ADS navigation? And from there also then say, hey, if we get all this together, are there any methodologies? Can we prototype some methodologies to help infrastructure owners and operators understand what are the different investment strategies? If they're making investments, how would they incorporate or account for ADS integration? The next part of this slide is the feasibility of a changeable roadway environment. And this is, as we said, feasibility. What we're trying to figure out is how do we evaluate providing kind of a realistic and easily changeable artificial roadway features, say curb, pavement markings, traffic control, things on the roadway that we could present a lot of different configurations and roughly stage different roadway scenarios. And this would help both roadway providers and automated driving systems understand this interface. So currently, there's a lot of interesting work going on there. We are fabricating artificial roadway elements for curb, pavement markings, barrier walls, and we hope to have a proof of concept and a demonstration later on. Next slide. One of the things that came up with automated driving systems is that they always want to comply with traffic regulations. But how do they do that? A lot of you are familiar with traffic regulations in a written form, and a lot of us have read them, tried to understand them. But how does an automated driving system understand traffic regulations? So we did a project and we prototyped basically a data framework to try to translate traffic regulations to something that ADS system could understand. And we did that, successfully, proof of concept, first kind of prototype. And now what we're doing, using that information to develop a playbook to support voluntary development of traffic regulation data specification. So we went from just looking at it and say, hey, is there a possibility here? How can we take different traffic laws and put them into some kind of digital format so that they can be understood by an automated driving system? And then now we're moving to how do we really move that to a next step of data specification. That brings us to today's webinar. And the focus of this discussion is on the concept of operation for road ADS integration. So now I'm going to hand it over to Deepak.
All right, thank you, John, and thank you for a really a good summary of all the activities that are happening. Part of the reason for the concept of operations was to connect the different initiatives that are happening around the idea of safely integrating this new mode, automated driving systems, into our transportation systems. So what I am going to be presenting today for the next about 10-15 minutes is the document. We won't be going through every section or every capability identified in the document, but to give you all a flavor of why this document was developed, how it was developed, and ultimately what its intended use, especially by the infrastructure owner operators, are. So the purpose of the concept of operations, really the concept of operations really emerged from some of the early national dialogues on highway automation, where federal highways and their convening role around describing how ADS technology can manifest itself on our public roads, how they interact with the current digital, physical, and operational layers of our transportation system, and what do we need to be doing so that that integration is safe, equitable, interoperable, and efficient. The ConOps is not intended as a national vision or strategy for ADS. It is intended as a potential resource to support transportation agencies as they consider integrating ADS into their research activities, into their pilot programs, into their testing, as well as operational deployments. So what does this offer? We've worked with the IOOs as well as the industry over the large part of the last 2 years in defining what ADS integration meant. And the big breakthrough for us was understanding that ADS integration is not about what the IOOs can do to support the use of automated driving systems on the road, but more on how do we manage this new aspect of operations. So one of the things the ConOps starts off with is stating the business case for road agency involvement. Why, among the many things that IOOs worry about, from pavements to bridges, why should ADS integration be a factor? What is the business case around infrastructure owner operators considering ADS and ultimately involving themselves in better integrating this new technology? As John Harding said, we've identified 8 representative use cases. The purpose of these use cases is not to pick winners or losers, but to identify how different ways of ADS use will drive different sets of needs on our transportation system and would require different capabilities from infrastructure owner operators. And those use cases, as well as our need to have this, as well as our desire to have effective social societal outcomes, generate the needs for the concept. And those needs drive the capabilities that we've identified in this document. Another important conceptual idea in this document is that ADS systems are not going to be available in the same manner everywhere. All the use cases there are going to vary widely by application, region, and mode. The deployment will probably occur in phases. And we largely see sort of ADS driving maturity in sort of 4 steps. There's a lot of testing and accommodation where you have 1 or 2 vehicles running and testing, or maybe a fleet of vehicles that are largely being on our roads to understand how they work and to see what challenges they have in navigating our transportation system. The next level around that is there's more of these vehicles. There's a desire to sort of include them more in our day-to-day operations, and that imposes a new set of needs. It further matures into cooperation and then ultimately optimization of automation in our transportation system. So these steps of maturity are sort of described in the ConOps, but they really sort of our attention is really focused on that second step, where we're saying, how do we get beyond the current sort of testing and accommodation phase and get to a point where these use cases are more widely deployed and being used as part of our day-to-day transportation mix, with the goal that ultimately you would move towards cooperative driving automation and even further in optimization. As we said, the business case for infrastructure owner operator involvement was something that we spent a lot of time on with our stakeholders. Why? When you have so many other needs from your in your transportation system, really the goal is to make sure that we, as owners of our system, achieve the outcomes we want to that we hope to achieve with ADS, which is including a safe system. Our operations needs to be more efficient. We realize the benefits and impacts of these technologies in an equitable manner, and ultimately these things work across jurisdictions, across states. And that's the achieving the outcomes is a key aspect of our business case. The second is to manage the trade-offs. We have finite resources within our infrastructure owner operator scope. How do you prioritize these investments? What should you be focusing in on in terms of capabilities or projects or priorities that'll help with achieving these societal outcomes? The third aspect of this business case is there is no one else taking a systemic view about how ADS fits in than the infrastructure owner operators. You have to worry about how ADS impacts operations, planning, the physical infrastructure systems, as well as the policies and the procedures. So the idea of taking a systemic view around ADS is something that it kind of drives the reason for infrastructure owner operator involvement in this area. And that is shown by the graphic that's, we call it the four-corner diagram, but really shows how operations, infrastructure, the planning, and sort of market pressures are all balanced as part of this effort. As we think through ADS, one of the things we heard early from our stakeholders was it's not a monolith. There are different types of applications being planned. They have different stakeholders, they have different consumers, they have different vendors and providers, and each of those has their own particular sets of challenges. So to not talk about this at a level where we mesh all these things together so it's not useful, we broke them down into these four categories: freight and package delivery, transit, individual travel and commuting, and agency operations. Under each, we kind of said what would be likely ADS use cases. So for package and freight and package delivery, we identified three use cases: one on long haul freight, which is sort of a freight moving across long distances on our interstates, but including getting off ramps to a distribution center. Local freight delivery, so freight delivery in the sort of middle mile, especially in and around sort of urban suburban areas. And then the last mile, the home and package delivery, where we have more varieties of vehicles and delivery the delivery pods that are being considered. In transit, we considered two use cases. One is more on sort of the fixed route transit, which includes sort of low-speed shuttles that are operating on a specific predefined right-of-way, to more sort of automated mobility on demand transit that have more flexibility in the routes they choose and more flexibility in pickup and drop-offs around the shuttles. And for individual travel and commuting, again, the two use cases identified were sort of fleet-based use cases. So where a fleet manager runs passenger vehicle fleets, sort of like what's happening today. And then more sort of privately owned ADS, where each of us might own a vehicle with a certain level 3, 4, or 5, which I think there's one vehicle that's now level 3 that is available for purchase. But so there's sort of different use cases around individual use of these systems. And lastly, we didn't want to forget this, and we saw quite a bit of excitement around some of the agency partners we spoke to around thinking about what possible applications exist for agency fleets, things like attenuated trucks, safety service patrol vehicles, and other sort of agency fleets that have the potential of supporting automated driving. So these were the use cases we looked at. So when we look at these use cases, and when we look at what we want to achieve, we get sort of the operational concept in the document, which is all of these use cases and all of these outcomes create the needs and the capabilities that are required. These capabilities, for now, are a way for us to organize not just federal highway, but our community efforts around ADS integration. And they really are sort of at the heart of the ConOps. So if you look through the document, we have over 60 or 70 of these capabilities that span the transportation spectrum, and they really define the collaborative action that's needed across our community. And what I mean by the community is the public, the federal, the state and local, the MPOs, the universities, the private sector, the consultants, the vendors. All of us have to figure out what aspects of these capabilities can be advanced. And it connects on the ongoing research, development, readiness actions at the federal, state, and local and industry level. So one of the goals of this ConOps from a very early standpoint that was expressed by stakeholders was that we need one place where we get to see how all the work that different agencies are doing, both internally for their own agencies, but also as part of pool funds, as part of university research, as part of pilot deployments, how do they all fit together? And this ConOps is an attempt to do that, where each capability can grow over time in its maturity and its effectiveness. As we go through slides today, we'll walk through one example in terms of long-haul freight, but what we're really hoping that this ConOps can do within an agency is it allows you to explore this idea of ADS integration. As you go through this document, we are hoping that it spurs consideration of, oh, I didn't think about this aspect or this need that might arise if I am considering a particular use case. It hopefully sparks ideas on where you need to do more work or enhance capabilities within your agencies around ADS, be it scenario planning, be it next generation transportation systems management, be it workforce. What are those capabilities that really make ADS integration a possibility? And working internally to see what your priorities are. Different agencies around the country might have different sort of capabilities that are well fleshed out today and others that need more work. And ultimately, working with things like organizations like AV Pool Fund and others, what are those capabilities that require a national effort? What are those capabilities that require sort of a multi-sectoral or a multi-stakeholder approach to advancing them? And those, I think, are sort of really the most exciting aspects of this. Where can we all work together to address those unanswered questions? With that, we wanted to walk you through one concept of operations flow. So where we go from this idea of sort of desired outcomes and think through a use case, see what needs emerge from that use case, how they kind of force you to think about capabilities and scenarios. And ultimately, by going through that process, we hope that as you're considering new use cases or new pilot deployments, or you're working with somebody who's come to you and said, hey, we want to test out a long-haul freight application or a low-speed transit shuttle, we can walk through this process and make sure that we are not missing any opportunity internally to engage with different aspects of our agencies as well. With that, let me turn it over to Laurie to walk us through an example.
Thanks, Deepak. I'm really excited to present these slides because it takes this whole ConOps and kind of puts a realness to them and digs deep into these needs and capabilities. And Deepak, if you would go to the previous slide again, this is how I'm going to present the next slides. I'm going to present the use case, talk about some needs, and tell you a little bit about where they came from. They flow into the capabilities and then the real world scenarios. And of course, you see this circle here where once you go into the real world, they can affect the next set of use cases. So kind of burn this image into your mind as I go through these next slides for this particular use case. And like we're saying, there's other use cases that we present in the document, but we're just going through one of them and walking you through this process. Okay, thank you, Deepak. Next slide. So we're going to be talking about long haul freight use case as an example, and that was in the category of freight and package delivery. So this image illustrates what that could look like. We take a truck transportation of goods from hubs to distribution centers, and then the freight is broken up to delivery to other businesses. But this is, we're talking about on-ramp, off-ramp, different types of traffic situations, free-flowing to congested, stop and go traffic, how these highly automated trucks will perform the driving tasks that are needed to execute this, this use case. Next slide. So we have the use case, and then we're going into there'll be 2 slides here of the integration needs. So we developed these integration needs from a really extensive stakeholder outreach. And a lot of you folks that are on the call today were involved in that. We talked to IOOs, OEMs, planning commissions, private companies, and developed these needs. And we further refined them with the team and federal agencies, FHWA, and this is what you see here in the ConOps. So for this particular use case for long haul freight, you can see the second one is the need for IOOs to communicate freight related road network changes. So this came directly from IOOs, further refined with subject matter expertise and all the folks that I mentioned. But these needs, these integration needs to have this use case come to fruition are really important. So think about, as you're using this ConOps, of what this actually means for you, for your agencies, and what you may be having to think about for long-range planning of your activities. Next slide. I'm not going to be going over every single one of these, but just pointing out a few of them. As John talked about in the previous slide, is understanding changes to local infrastructure. So that can come in different ways, and it can affect local infrastructure and land use. So you can start to see how a lot of different capabilities can come out of these needs, and really start to affect how you proceed with integrating these ADS systems. So next slide. These next 2 slides will be talking about relevant capabilities in 4 categories: planning and policy, cyber physical, operations and services, and cross-cutting capabilities. So we pull out this one, they're all categorized. When you see the document, you'll see how they're all categorized and shown into different number system, PP6, which really doesn't mean anything other than that's just a way of how we've organized it, the planning and policy 6th capability. Legislation and policies. So if your agency does not have any legislation and policies readily available for ADS providers, start thinking about that. And in terms of cyber physical infrastructure, once again, this changeable physical and digital infrastructure, thinking about lane use, roadside elements, and what needs to be put in place to accommodate and integrate ADS. Next slide. So we've gone through the needs and the here's 2 others. Sorry about that. The other categories: operations and services and cross-cutting. I love the cross-cutting one because it talks about how the capability of the impacts of ADS on employment and thinking about workforce development is really important. That's the first capability here under cross-cutting. Also operations and services, this OS4 established practices for sharing traffic-related operational strategies with ADS vehicles. And that could be applicable to a traffic management center. I would think that's one of the first examples I can think of. So this really gives you some backing to what the needs are with particular use cases, and these capabilities are relevant to a lot of the other use cases in one way or another. Next slide. So we've talked about needs and capabilities, real world scenarios. We've assigned real world scenarios to all of these use cases. In this particular one, the long haul freight, we've talked about conditions and geographical context and roadway types, and then broke it down into how to achieve the desired societal outcome for all of these categories here: safe system, efficient operations, interoperable systems, and equitable benefits and impacts. Next slide. As we go further into the real world scenario, there are great opportunities for industry collaboration. And this ConOps creates that structure. So if you look at this document in terms of the capabilities, then you have the activities, which will need to be working in the real world, whether that's testing, whether that's developing standards and guidance or deployment. We've assigned key players to each of those activities. Obviously, the standards and guidance, you would need standards development organizations. But the deployment and the partnerships, that can be public-private partnerships and models and industry engagement and research and development, thinking about pooled fund studies, and R&D and academia can come into this as a key player for that activity. Very important to play this out and see how then, once we do these real world scenarios, we can get some lessons learned and go back and refine those use cases, and then go through that same system of the needs and the capabilities. And of course, through the needs, keep on grabbing those desired incomes from stakeholders. And that's important to keep refining this whole entire system, if you will. Next slide. So of the policy and planning example of the capabilities category, we think about transportation workforce, and I did highlight that when I was talking about that in that previous slide. And here is a real world example of how research and stakeholder engagement can be executed through the Office of Policy and Scenario Planning, and the Office of Planning, and these collaborative development projects and planning models. So this is, I hope I've gone through with you and you've gotten a better understanding as to how we're using these use cases and how that whole system of needs, capabilities, scenarios can keep informing itself and keep going towards a higher level of ADS. So the next slide and the next speakers, Ben and Jeremy, will be actually talking about and further exploring these, building these capabilities. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ben and Jeremy.
Hi, thank you, Lori. That was great. I'm going to go first. I'm Ben Hawkinson from the Office of Policy and Government Affairs. And for the next few minutes, I'm going to take you back in time. And Jeremy will talk about some more issues that he's taking care of currently. So what did we do? Why do we do this? Deepak, can you go to the next slide? So about 8 to 10 years ago, the AV landscape, I think we'd all agree, was largely unknown. We wanted to develop something that would help metropolitan planning organizations, states, and other agencies prepare for this new and disruptive technology. So we had about 30 professionals from across the country, from MPOs, state agencies, Federal Highway Administration, and others. So what did we want to do? Wanted to do two things. First, we wanted to equip states and local agencies with information and tools that enable them to account for the uncertainties of CVs and AVs through scenario planning. And two, we wanted to document the process and methodology used to develop the scenarios with the goal of enabling these groups to carry out their own scenario plans. We knew that nothing was going to be the same. It's not going to be the same thing in San Francisco that it is going to be in rural North Carolina. So we wanted to have some, but we wanted to give a basis for something. And then these groups and agencies could think about it and tailor it for their own needs. And next is, here's an overview of the scenario planning process. 6 steps. For me, at least, I think the first 3 steps are the gathering the facts part of the process, understanding what's going around, what are the goals you want to achieve, that sort of thing. The next 2, 4, and 5 allow agencies to refine the scenarios for their unique needs, which I think was very helpful. Like I said, about 8-10 years ago, people and groups were, we know we need to do something, but we just don't know, quite how to start. So I think this helped a little bit. And the last one, number 6, is assessing and monitoring and making improvements where they need to be. Then here are just the scenario building blocks. The drivers, that's what we have. The levers, these are some things that we can somewhat adjust. And the outcomes, which we hope are hopefully improvements. And the next one will show the 6 scenarios that we came up with. These are plausible scenarios. We didn't say that these were going to happen or they are going to happen, but you can see the details here. And these will be on our website, Federal Highway Administration, Office of Policy's website sometime this month. We'll have the link in the chat. And the next one is, we knew there would be a lot of risks. I think that's the most important thing in scenario planning, is understanding the risk, whether it's costs. You can see we had inadequate EV charging. That's now being addressed. So these are some things that the scenario planning came up with. So we were just concerned. We wanted to make sure that there are risks here and people understood the risks and that we took them into account. So with that, I will turn it over to my friend Jeremy Raw from the Office of Planning.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so one of the findings that we had from the workshop that led to the scenario definitions that Ben just described is that people really want to be able to quantify what they're thinking about with the scenarios. And an approach that we'd taken to this was to leverage a strategic planning tool that was originally developed for examining household travel impacts of transportation pricing effects, particularly focused on VMT and greenhouse gas emissions, but also looking at mode choice, costs of vehicle operation, and the rest. And we saw an opportunity back in the day to extend Vision Eval in the direction of handling some of these scenarios that Ben was talking about. And so we set up a pooled fund to extend Vision Eval, not specifically to go after the automated driving system scenarios, but to just generally enhance the tool. And we established a parallel project to that with the Intelligent Transportation Systems Joint Program Office. It's been through 2 phases. There will probably be a 3rd phase, and I'll talk about that right at the end. And the aim of that was to give people tools to think early on about these scenarios so that they could do what we call strategic planning, a variation of scenario planning where we're aiming at figuring out what kinds of actions we could take to achieve desired outcomes or avoid outcomes that we would prefer not to have. I think we can go on to the next slide here. This slide has adapted a diagram that was originally developed by Oregon Department of Transportation. It's what they call their STORM diagram for strategic, tactical, operational, and reporting and monitoring, to look at the kinds of models and analysis that are appropriate at different stages in the planning and project development process. And so you can read down this yourself. Vision Eval lives out there in the strategic realm. This is where we do scenario planning, and it's where we think about things like automated driving systems that we don't have a lot of examples of on the road. It's not clear how they're going to scale, and we'd like to understand where they're going. There's more information on Vision Eval. I'll give you a link at the end of this presentation. Let's move to the next slide. What we did with the ITS JPO project was start to look at ways in which we might capture effects of automated driving systems and connected vehicles on outcomes of interest. And so we began to look at road capacity effects, understanding the influence of different urban area types, looking at the technologies themselves. Let's have the next slide. And work this out so that we could start to understand what are we thinking about roadway attributes, market penetration, vehicle driving dynamics, and what the influences might be on metrics of interest when we start doing scenario planning. Ideally, when we're doing that, we're going to be focusing on performance measures, trying to make estimates of how much factors of interest might shift, what happens to mode share, what happens with zero occupant vehicles and deadheading of automated vehicles that can drive themselves. You know, the nightmare scenario there being that we give up parking lots and parking spaces, we just have curb space management, and instead literally turn our roads into parking lots with a bunch of empty vehicles driving around waiting for the next passenger. So those are the kinds of scenarios we wanted to give people a handle on and a way to quantify what might happen with this. Now, if you've been paying close attention to the earlier discussion that we had today in this webinar about the ConOps and its involvement in this, you'll notice that each of these line items suggest things that might be informed by really understanding how these systems work on the road. And so the work that we're doing in Vision Eval and that led out of the scenario planning really does bend back around to the ConOps as an extraordinarily useful document for formulating the kinds of situations that you'd like to evaluate, the possibilities for these technologies and the potential challenges. All right, let's have the next slide, which I think is actually my last one. So where we're going with this, we have been through 2 phases of the project. We do actually have a module for Vision Eval that can evaluate mostly assumptions about, performance of connected and automated vehicles, use of them for shared mobility, impacts of zero occupant vehicles, and do this in the context of the overall Vision Eval framework, aiming at those performance measures that I zipped past earlier in my comments here, looking at VMT, looking at mode share, looking at household ownership costs and costs of operation of vehicles, so that we can really start to investigate things like equity implications of shared mobility and, what happens when it's more or less available to certain communities. We do have that prototype of code available on Vision Eval. If you're interested in implementing it, I'd encourage you to reach out to me, jeremy.raw@dot.gov, and we can walk you through that. The overall visioneval.org project site has a lot of information, including links to documentation that we've been beefing up considerably to explain the tool and how it's used in the planning process. The documentation for the prototype is available. It's in the process of making its way into publication on the National Transportation Library. The JPO folks are helping me with that. And we're hoping to refine and test that code in case studies in the coming year or so. If you're interested in the tool, if you're interested in being one of the case studies, please do reach out to me as well, and we'd be happy to incorporate you in that process. So at this point in our presentation, I'm going to hand it back to John Corbin, the mastermind of the ConOps, and he'll go into that in more detail. And I want to encourage you to keep in mind Vision Eval, the scenario planning approach, and the rest, because we do think that this is one of the great applications of the ConOps to really try to get a practical, concrete handle on what might happen with these technologies. John, off to you.
Hey, Jeremy, thank you so much. And of all the titles you could give me, Mastermind would be overly generous and the most exceptionally positive. So thank you so kindly, and thank you for your leadership in concert with Ben, illustrating the intent of the concept of operations as a tool to be integrated with other tools, ultimately for the purpose of supporting state and local and regional agencies in integrating automation and other emerging mobility technologies into practice. Any new tool set begs lessons to be learned and answering some fundamental questions such as how do you use it, what is it capable of, how might it need to be refined, what additional tools may be needed. I don't know if you've ever purchased recently, either for yourself or as a gift, a very large for example, Craftsman tool set, which might have a couple hundred different types of tools in it. If you receive or if you buy for yourself a toolkit like that, you end up asking yourself those questions very early on in kind of laying out those tools in front of you, realizing that it's ultimately going to come down to that first project, whether it be replacing a sensor on your car or trying to fix a leak under your sink. And that's going to be when you really start to understand the adequacy, you know, of the specific tool set. And so as we move forward in implementing, next slide, please, Deepak, as we move forward in introducing, implementing, and assessing the ConOps in conjunction with other existing and emerging tools from USDOT and other partner organizations, we're really going to be following two parallel tracks. One will be a track to assess, evaluate, and refine the concept of operations. And as we do that, we'll also, in parallel, be seeking to introduce, engage you and other stakeholders and customers and implement the ConOps actually in parallel with its further evaluation and evolution. As part of the evaluation of the concept of operations, we're going to begin, in fact, it's underway currently with Deepak and Lori and others on the contractor team supporting this project to identify an assessment model, if you will, a logic model to understand what types of questions we need to ask you as you begin to play with and apply the ConOps. Questions about whether it's understandable, whether it's usable, whether it's flexible enough as you apply it, how it may be valuable, how it could perhaps be more valuable. Certainly, we want to be quantitative to the extent possible and think in terms of metrics so that we can compare and contrast your experiences and the relative value of those experiences with the ConOps. As we then incrementally over the next 18 to 24 months, if you will, supportively shadow you in implementing and using and learning from your experiences with the ConOps, we want to anticipate the next version of the ConOps. Not unlike, for example, the national ITS architecture, we realize this needs to be a nearly continuously evolving tool. And so between now and the end of 2024, as we migrate from the current version of the ConOps towards either an updated version or a more complete second version of the ConOps, we'll be commingling these activities related to implementation and related to evaluation. Next slide, please. A centerpiece of the implementation process as we begin and continue this type of introduction and outreach and orientation activity is a mechanism we're kind of inventing and titling of prototype implementation sites. As Lori so excellently characterized the experiences of developing the ConOps is not intended to reflect, you know, federal content and beltway quote unquote expertise and top-down direction. Rather, it is a reflection of what we learned from you and what we heard from you. And we use, you may recall, the beta site mechanisms in which a number of you and Ashley again, very clearly and in a very timely way, recalled her experiences and her orientation in the context of one of those beta sites to the intent of the ConOps and to afford input into it. And so we had about 16 of those beta sites where we worked with you, we learned from you, we listened to you, and as Deepak can attest, we very aggressively modified a preliminary draft of the ConOps in response to what we heard. We want to continue that spirit with the prototype sites, ultimately to enable and to interface with the evaluation activity, but ultimately to refine the ConOps and adapt it better to your needs. Next slide, please. The prototype sites we're envisioning would encompass, you know, approximately 20 sites. Ideally, if we end up with 5 or 6, that's fine. If we end up with, you know, 25, that's okay. If we end up with 50, we might have to rethink the strategy. But we want to have a set of sites that might be a specific agency, state DOT, local Department of Transportation, metropolitan planning organization. It might be a partnership, a regional partnership, a regional collaborative entity, a multi-state corridor, perhaps a national partnership, such as the Automated Vehicle Pooled Fund Study, or a committee or working group that is working in this space of automation integration. We certainly realize that there will also be those of you who are industry partners and industry leaders in consulting, in the vendor community, in the technology innovation space, that may help introduce us to prototype sites that may, for example, include SMART grant awardees or ATTAIN grant awardees, or might be part of existing ADS demonstration grants. So a primary intent and objective of this webinar is to make you aware of this prototype site approach and the prototype implementation goals, but more importantly, to engage your interest and to engage your questions. So if you have no other actions that you've jotted down so far from the webinar, and I hope you have a few, please consider the action item of deliberating your prospective interest in participating in or pointing us to one of these implementation sites. We do not at this time have any separately dedicated new funding. However, we do have existing resources to assist you through the funding that is in the contract and the availability of the contractor team. We also are working closely with our partners within USDOT over at the Volpe Transportation Center, where there are experts that can be integrated into this process. Certainly, we hope that it will position you and will perhaps even be a consideration in future grant awards and may be integrated, for example, into your grant proposals. On your part, we want to be as limited in the imposition as possible, and so we will look to engage you in meetings in an efficient way, to listen to your input in a way that fits into your existing processes, your existing organizational or programmatic activities. Next slide, please. So kind of back to the context that John Harding set as we come in for a landing over the next few slides and wrap up the webinar. John did a really great job reminding us and even reminding me of the different strata of our current FHWA program activities related to the integration of automation and automated driving systems, in particular into the roadway network. And you may recall he highlighted that first layer, which was about collaboration and institutional integration and institutional coordination. And I appreciated his acknowledgement of the CAT Coalition, driven by vital partners such as AASHTO, ITS America, ITE, other partner organizations that we're getting to know much better, such as SAE and 5GAA and others. And that certainly is a key part of the institutional layer, the institutional collaboration that is an underpinning of our evolving capabilities and service to you. John also highlighted, and we can migrate maybe to the next slide, Deepak, that the understanding of the interface in the horizontal plane of this diagram with the physical features of the roadway, and whether it's an automated driving systems or ADAS or just a human-driven vehicle with increasing features that enhance their ability to perceive the roadway environment, that perception and interface with the physical features, including those that can be changeably integrated into test environments, as John highlighted, is a very important part of enabling the integration of the concept of operations and the application of the concept of operations. This vertical dimension of the institutional interface, again, is another manifestation of that institutional integration, that integration between humans and between the organizations within which we work. But arguably, kind of a centerpiece, not the exclusive centerpiece, but one of the centerpieces of enabling the integration of automation and emerging mobility technologies, whether it recognizes the horizontal dimension of this environment or the vertical dimension of this environment or the broader national collaboration overlay of this environment, is digital infrastructure in general, and specifically roadway digital infrastructure in particular. We can go to the next slide, please. As we're using this term, we're really using a term that has a set of evolving, and I'll say incrementally, not necessarily always linearly converging definitions of what digital infrastructure in general, roadway digital infrastructure consists of. But in general, I think there's an emerging consensus that it involves information and communication technologies and the data that those technologies create, transmit, analyze, and apply to the management of the roadway network, whether you're a user of the network, a manager of the network, whether you're looking at the operational characteristics of that roadway network, the structural and infrastructure health aspects of that network, or the applications of that network within an economic context, such as a supply chain, or in the context of resilience and emergency response, and even military mobility. So next slide, please. As we continue to evolve towards consensus on the definition of roadway digital infrastructure, we're really reminded that it is not a new concept. And even in the early half of the previous century, there was a notion that we needed infrastructure to connect vehicles with the roadway, and the roadway with other civic infrastructure systems. Particularly over the last 30 years, I would say even more dramatically over the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen what was a gradual evolution turn into an almost convulsive disruption across a number of these dimensions of what constitute roadway digital infrastructure. For example, we've seen the discussion about spectrum and technologies associated with spectrum evolve from dedicated to increasingly shared spectrum models. We've seen the rapid emergence of edge and cloud computing, in many respects enabling the distributed application and more broad global integration of even artificial intelligence. We've seen vehicle and roadway-based sensors that had historically been deployed and owned almost exclusively by government agencies, increasingly deployed by industry, and even crowdsourced through that cloud and edge environment through third-party data integrators and information as a service providers. We've seen communication networks, even ground-based or wired communication networks, again, in the roadway environment that initially were largely government-owned, become increasingly industry-based communication networks. And so that institutional migration from primarily or almost exclusively public to public-private business models, the cross-disciplinary implications of an environment in which government agencies increasingly have more of a systems management, procurement management, business model management role, and somewhat less over time of an infrastructure owner-operator role relative to the actual information and communication technologies, is all being driven by this migration from a government primarily to a more blended government industry model. In the context of policy, things have also become much more, I'll say complex, but also much more sophisticated. And whereas 30 years ago, we were talking about digital infrastructure in the terminology of intelligent transportation systems, primarily in terms of reducing urban traffic congestion, that is now subordinated to much higher level public policy considerations related to things like public health and the safe system approach, user-oriented accessibility, sustainable community connectivity, all of which, while driven by public policy, are increasingly nationally synchronized in the public-private space and market-driven. Next slide, please. outputs of that roadway digital infrastructure, both in its existing form and in the strategic vision that we know we need to define and move toward, ultimately is defined by outputs and outcomes. Outputs premised, as I was mentioning earlier, at its base about the roadway network performance and the optimization of that performance, both structurally and operationally. We're seeing built on that increasingly a three-dimensional multimodality that integrates ground and air transportation systems and services. We're seeing that broadened into other, as I alluded to them earlier, civic infrastructure systems such as the grid and the pipeline and other energy infrastructure systems, the broader telecommunications infrastructure and civic digital infrastructure within which transportation and nested within that roadway digital infrastructure exists, ultimately for the purpose of serving and enabling and empowering people in smart communities and along smart corridors. If these are the outputs, the outcomes related to a roadway digital infrastructure pertain to, again, as I mentioned earlier, public health and public safety outcomes, including those related to civic resilience associated with emergency response and military mobility, economic resilience fed and enabled by freight mobility and enhanced and optimized performance of the supply chain, and then equitable and sustainable accessibility within and between communities, both by ground modes, but increasingly by air and other modes as well. Next slide, please. This migration, it is being really fueled and dramatically accelerated, both by need, but also by opportunity afforded by funding. The icons on the right side of this slide should bring to mind, for example, the SMART grant program. I mentioned others earlier. This availability of funding, not just at the federal level, but at the state and local level on the public sector side, is being matched, in some cases overshadowed by investment on the industry side toward economic opportunities associated with the value of data, for example, within the automotive community, the provision of services to and through communities in the telecommunications industry. And so while we think in terms of the billions of dollars, for example, under IIJA and bill being afforded on the public sector side, we need to remember that the opportunity is being actually amplified and further convulsed and disrupted by investment on the industry side. Next slide, please. So based on that, we have been in a conversation with a number of you on this call, really for at least the last 5 years, looking at how we rediscover, reinvent, revitalize, and refocus our interests, shared interests nationally in intelligent transportation systems, communications technologies, and more broadly, roadway digital infrastructure into a strategy, an actionable strategy on which we can collaborate in the 21st century. I mentioned 5 years ago, because some of you may recall, and it was actually in Seattle, that this particular workshop was conducted as part of the 2018 FHWA National Dialogue on Highway Automation. I think that was one of the first events that we ended up deciding to title with the two words digital infrastructure. What we learned from that workshop was we had a lot to learn and a lot to discuss. And so we brought that content into a number of initiatives, including an effort within FHWA to define a definitional framework for roadway digital infrastructure, beginning just within FHWA. Early last year, in the ITS America, in some respects, I think really provided kind of a spark of ignition through leadership and engagement from kind of an industry partner organization perspective and a broader stakeholder engagement enterprise. We saw the results of that, as well as other inputs, catalyzing a very understandable, I think, and compelling characterization of the US DOT's interest and role in digital infrastructure embodied in the Research Development and Technology Strategic Plan, released very early this year, the RD&T Strategic Plan. I know Ashley and colleagues in the Haas Center of Excellence contributed dramatically to that. I also want to acknowledge not just also valuable partners, but the funder, the key funder of this organization, the ITS Joint Program Office. I know Hung Jun Park and others I saw on the call earlier. And so you're seeing this convergence within USDOT around the theme, not necessarily leading, but actually in parallel with the convergence of definition and purpose and strategy on the term external to USDOT. We commenced a series of activities in partnership with ITS America and various TRB committees at the January meeting of the Transportation Research Board. Some of you may have been at, and we greatly appreciated your contributions to the Roadway Digital Infrastructure Workshop on January 12th. We convened a smaller, more invitational focus group meeting within the project that Deepak and his team are supporting on the topic of digital infrastructure in late March. We supportively participated in the workshop that ITS America hosted on the Monday of their annual meeting at the end of April in Texas. And we celebrated with ITS America the first Digital Infrastructure Week a few weeks ago. And through this conversation, I think the most important part is not the calendar of events. It is a clearly focusing and emerging stakeholder expectation or set of expectations of what a national strategy should address, at least at this point in time in terms of principles and goals. Specific elements of a strategy will be evolved over the remainder of this calendar year, and we're looking forward to sharing it with you for the purpose of engagement, really as a straw dog or an illustrative draft that will beg refinement as part of the TRB annual meeting in January of 2024. Just to give you kind of a bit of a foretaste, these are some of the suggested principles of the strategy that we've heard so far. I know ITS America and their Digital Infrastructure Working Group and their Smart Infrastructure Committee, their V2X committee are seeing similar things, some additional things, and we're looking forward to continuing to compare notes and align notes. But on the left column of these suggested strategy principles that we've heard so far, we're hearing a desire to evolve but maintain flexibly and collaboratively, not looking for a one-size-fits-all or a very rigid top-down federally based strategic approach. We recognize that to be sustainable and viable across administrations, across partisan wins over time, we're going to have to focus on more transcendent, desirable societal outcomes. Within those outcomes, ensuring and protecting privacy is perhaps a primary, but also as part of that, ensuring that we're keenly aware and vigilant when it comes to security. On the right side of this kind of two columns of principles, we're seeing things that are more programmatic. We're hearing pretty consistently that we need to focus on existing enterprise data systems, whether those be in a state DOT or local government or within an industry enterprise, and not seek to add layers to the complexity, but rather evolve through consensus-based standards and open architectures and open source software solutions, mechanisms that protect investments and protect the profitability and the incentives in intellectual property, but also accommodate openness to anticipate enhanced interoperability, not just through technical solutions and technologies, but through architectural principles and systems engineering approaches. And that kind of lands on this issue of openness and flexibility. The potential strategy goals, if I had to offer some to you today, and I don't, and I'm not, but if I did, these would be what have stood out so far. Interoperable connected transportation through dedicated spectrum V2X strategies, through other cellular network-based and other broader V2X strategies, through other multifaceted solutions that afford interoperable connectivity through the national digital layer that supports our roadway operations and our roadway infrastructure management are all part of kind of the cornerstone of creating next generation interoperable connectivity and connected transportation systems. I mentioned already this focus on modernizing existing enterprise data systems in both public and private sectors, accelerating, catalyzing, and also more efficiently harvesting the knowledge being generated by operational data experimentation and innovations, including those that are being enabled and accelerated by US DOT and other federal grant programs. Finally, perhaps most critically, in my view, and we're kind of landing where John Harding started, talking about collaboration models, collaboration enterprises, making sure that we are creating not burdensome, but valuable, accelerating enterprises and institutions and partnerships to share lessons learned, to share innovations, to inform and focus industry towards client needs that may be on the public sector side, and to do a better job of focusing and preparing public sector role to not only inform, but to embrace, integrate, and evaluate those digital infrastructure innovations. As I mentioned, we've been in a conversation for a number of years. That conversation has been accelerated over the last six months to define kind of the strategic content, the initial illustrative draft, straw dog strategic content of what a national roadway or a national roadway network digital infrastructure strategy may consist of. We look forward to bringing that to you beginning over the next 6 months, but then also at the end of that 6 months in conjunction, actually, I think starting almost exactly 6 months not 6 months from today, 7 months from today at the TRB annual meeting in January. So with that, I just will again resonate with John and Ashley's introduction, gratefully acknowledge Deepak, Lori, Ben, and Jeremy for fantastic and insightful content. I shouldn't admit that I was learning and jotting notes because I've seen so much of this before, but I did. I really do appreciate those of you. I think at one point we have had over 80 people taking time to join us in today's webinar. I know we do have time and look forward to entertaining your questions. While I was speaking, I was not looking at the chat pod, so I apologize if I missed any that were pointed to me. Maybe Luana, Deepak, I'll lean on your assistance for any cues if things popped up that we may need to catch up with.
Absolutely, John. And I'll sort of go through, we have several questions, comments in the chat that I will pick up and pose to several of you relating to your portions of the presentation. I will try to be a good scribe and not sort of editorialize those questions, so that just take a little bit of time. We'll start with some of the easy ones first. Darren and others who are looking for slides on this, yes, Luana will send out slides to at the webinar recording to all the webinar participants. And then let me start off with something pretty straightforward. Jeremy, there were some questions on where to find this vision eval. I saw that you answered that to the team, but if you wanted to offer any more insights on where to find any of the vision eval documentation or software.
Yeah, I think the landing page for all of it is visioneval.org. I put that in the chat and also in a question response, I believe. We do have regularly updated code available through the GitHub repository, and we are settling a major advance in the software that's going to also be available directly through the visioneval.org site. That will be coming up within the next few weeks. I did see a question, Deepak, and I'll just keep rolling here for a minute about the pilot projects that I mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
We will be looking around for partners who are interested in deploying Vision Eval for strategic planning and scenario planning purposes. who would be interested in examining some of the AV issues that we coded up in the phase 2 project, and then potentially enlarging it a little bit to accommodate some of the things we talked about today with the ConOps. The best way to find out about that is to lodge your interest with me. And so I'll put my email address into one of the Q question answers that I'm working on now. We'll have that actually in writing too. Okay.
Thank you, Jeremy. And Julia, your question on is robotaxi type use cases belong in a private fleet use case? That is exactly right. That's where we have them listed. So I just want to acknowledge that. And then a question for either John Harding or John Corbin from John Contestable. It kind of ties into some of the future questions as well, is how might the sites John Corbin is describing be selected? John, if you was talking about the prototype sites that we have, and the parent ticket was there be an RFI or any other, what method are we planning to use?
Yeah, we're contemplating a multi-step process that at some point does actually involve a physical competition on a proving grounds, but no, I'm kidding. It is a very casual process, John C. And you know, we want to be flexible, quite frankly, because had we overly prescribed the beta sites that we used to develop the ConOps, which we didn't, we reached out and we engaged and we kind of played into the space that the sites offered us. We learned things we wouldn't have learned had we had a prescriptive, rigid, criteria-based screen in, screen out. So, you know, we do have some constraints on staff time and contractor funded resource to engage. But at this point in time, we're just starting the process. We will seek to follow up with you and the broader external stakeholder community with perhaps a more specific and actionable solicitation. It won't necessarily be an RFI, but maybe just a broadly distributed email saying, here's in general, you know, more concisely than John Corbin described on the webinar, here's what we're looking for. And are you interested? Can we have a conversation? And I would anticipate a next step to that would be probably just some casual, one-on-one or small group conversations or brief virtual meetings to explore and kind of compare and contrast areas of interest.
Thanks, John. And
I'll just add real quickly another in transparency. And it actually kind of was illustrated by Jeremy, your comments on the pilot sites. We do want to be keenly aware that both on the industry side, but certainly also on the public sector side, you do not have the amount of time to engage, in these national activities the way you or your predecessors did 10 or 15 years ago. And we realize time is very precious and limited, even just to sit through an hour-and-a-half webinar. We're very grateful for your investment of the value of that time. And so we want to make sure we're aligned internally. And I didn't really talk about this because I didn't want to run over, but just so you know, in addition to assessing and evaluating the ConOps externally and beginning to implement it, we also are going to be following a parallel process internal to US DOT. And incidental to that, we want to make sure that as we approach you and seek your partnership on the prototype sites, we're doing so in a way that integrates parallel activities to engage you, for example, on the activities associated with the collaborative research framework that John Harding alluded to, and the traffic regulations project that Kingsley is working on, and some of the AV scenario work that Jeremy talked about. So we want to make sure that as part of that engagement of you on the prototype sites, you're not getting multiple hands seeking assistance from USDOT related to this general topic, but that we have a internally coordinated outreach to you that makes efficient use of your interest and engagement. Sorry, Deepak, thank you.
No worries. I just have one question, and then I want to get to Israel, a couple of questions from Israel Lopez as well. John, I think this is a question from Eric Hill, where I think you were talking about smart grants and proposals. I think there's the question that might make clarification. Is there a grant to apply for prototype implementation? And I think that's not what we intended, but just maybe to clarify that these prototype implementation sites are more sort of us reaching out as part of the contractor team. So if you want to just give some clarification on that, we are looking at sort of smart grant sites as potential locations. So.
Correct. And apologies for leaving any confusion on that. No, we do not have any additional dedicated funding sources at this point in time to offer to prototype sites or incentivize prototype sites. We're hopeful that we can leverage the value and maybe even contribute to further to the value of existing federal grants like SMART or CANE grant awards, and at least offer the value of our services, whether it be from the US DOT, including modal agencies or VOLPE staff time, or the contractors already funded time within the contract supporting the development and implementation of the ConOps. So again, no new money, no separate new dedicated grants or funding for the prototype sites, somewhat apologetically, at least at this point in time. But we certainly will look for opportunities that may be related and share them with you proactively.
Thank you. And I think there's some very important questions from Israel that kind of get to the heart of our digital infrastructure strategy as well, John. So this might be still you. We're also curious if there are comments from others on the panel as well, which is that as we go through to ADS integration, as we've noted, the management of all the infrastructure, not just physical, but also digital infrastructure, becomes a challenge for DOTs. Especially the use of technology systems. So the question that's being asked, which is, what sort of deployment management frameworks are we recommending? Are we going with sort of some of the existing things out there like the EA standard or ITIL ITSM or any other sort of things that look at both system currency and cybersecurity? So it's a really good question. I think there are some context provided by Israel as well. So we might follow up with you, Israel, on more of these as we develop the strategy, but wanted to give John some thoughts or comments, and especially as it ties into the digital strategy as well.
Yeah, so I alluded to, I think I used the term at least once, I alluded to architectural principles, and where architectural principles suggest not just the technical or infrastructure technology systems dimension of architecture, but also the institutional and even the policy dimensions of broader, if you will, system of systems architecture. And so whereas the national ITS architecture certainly recognizes the enterprise and the institutional layer, it is designed primarily to address the technical and technological dimension. And so this issue, which I'm going to choose to kind of extrapolate into talking about kind of organizational and institutional sustainability of the specific digital technology models that may be supported or enabled by a national roadway network digital infrastructure, it is a very important consideration. And I expect that it will be addressed by a piece of the strategy that we engage you on between now and January and in January under this kind of banner or within the blob, if you will, of architectural principles, which will suggest the need, I think, for follow-up activities next year and into the following year that consider alternative technologies, particularly in that piece about National Roadway Network interoperable connectivity or interoperable connected transportation systems, and the specific types of communication technologies that are used in some cases by the public sector, I think increasingly by the private sector, and how that blended public-private organizational role can be, I don't want to say prescribed, but can be coordinated in a way that is sustainable and doesn't adopt communications technology and digital infrastructure approaches that may be feasible to buy for a public agency, but very challenging, if not impossible, to reliably and securely operate and maintain. And I realize that's not getting holistically, and I welcome, I look forward, Deepak, to following up with you in conversation with Israel to better explore and develop that issue. But that's my kind of initial reaction related to architectural principles and how we project better responses to your questions, Israel, into the architectural principles component of a, I'll say, straw dog strategy to be under development soon.
Yeah, and John, I think that's a fair standpoint, Israel. As we go through this, we have to address the question that you've asked, and in particular, even sort of in some of the diagrams about where we have to understand and sort of manage that systems element in the standard. So appreciate your comment. We've heard the similar sort of feedback from stakeholders, so I think we will take that into consideration, and we'll probably work with you to figure out what the next steps are. I think those are all the questions I had. We are right at 2:30. So Luana, if you want to close out with any NOCOE thoughts or any other comments, we can sort of close the webinar.
Yeah, thank you so much. On behalf of NOCO, I'd like to thank all our panelists. This really was a very informative webinar. And also thank you to all the participants that are here today. If you have any questions, please feel free to follow up with us. I will send you the link to the recording and also the PDF with slides. And if you need anything else, just let me know. And thank you. Hope to see you again soon. And you may now disconnect.